In today's video, I'm taking this hard maple and turning it into this end grain cutting board. At the end of the video, I will be going over what I did wrong, what I did right, and what I'll be doing differently if I ever do end up making another end grain cutting board again, which I'm not sure if I will based off the current tool set that I have. You'll find out why in just a second. Let's get started. So first things first, I got this hard maple board cut down to size. Now I wanted my cutting board to end up being 17 by 12 by 2 inches. The hard maple that I was working with was a 2x6 board, so I knew I needed to cut at least 3 planks from it to make this cutting board, knowing that I would have some scrap left over. But I wanted to give myself plenty of room for error since this was my first time making an end grain. There is some math to do because you have to take into account the width of the blade when you're cutting, especially when you're cutting it widthwise. You're going to be making quite a few passes, and that'll end up actually taking out a good inch of the board. You'll see what I mean in just a second after the first glue up, when we have to take it over to the miter saw to cut it widthwise to then flip it over to get our actual end grain pattern. Now, since I didn't have a jointer or a planer when I started this project, I bought some S3S boards from the local hardwood store. That just means it was serviced on 3 sides, so there was only 1 side left to do, which I could take care of with my table saw here. So now that we got all the boards squared up and ready to go, I was trying to use as much of the board as possible, not letting any go to waste. But at the end, it was easier just for me to set the table saw at 2 inches and run the boards through, knowing that I would have some trimming and some scrap left over at the end. And as you can see here, I have some burning going on when I was pushing it through the table saw. This is a construction grade table saw with a construction grade blade on it. I did put a Diablo 60 tooth on it, but that actually made it a lot harder for the saw to get through these hard maple boards. So I was encountering some burning when I was pushing the boards through the table saw, but luckily all of the burns seen here on the wood will be inside of the glue up. All right, so now that we got all the strips cut for the first glue up, I brought them over to the table here, just trying to find the right order here so that all the seams line up the best and we have as little gaps as possible before the glue up. I was also in need of some longer clamps, so I took this opportunity, ran over to Harbor Freight and got some of their 3/4 inch pipe clamps. I then went to the hardware store, got some 60-inch, 3/4 inch black pipe, cut them in half. That way I would have 4 total 30-inch pipes, which I knew would be plenty long enough for this cutting board. So I cut each one of these 1.5-inch square strips to 24 inches long. That way, when I took it over to the miter saw to cut the 2-inch blocks, and subtracting the kerf of the blade times the amount of cuts I would make, this would put me right around that 17 inches at the end. I knew it wasn't going to be right on. I wasn't trying to get my math perfect. This was a cutting board I was making for myself and my wife, so as long as I was around that 17-inch mark, I was going to be happy with it. I put glue on everything, all the surfaces that were going to be touching each other, obviously. I did add some scrap pieces of wood to both sides, just to make sure the pipe clamps didn't leave any imprints or dents in the sides of the wood I was going to use for the cutting board. Once I got everything in position for the glue up, I took my rubber mallet and just lovingly tapped each one into place, trying to get them as flat as possible while slowly tightening each of the clamps. I did have a 1/2-inch pipe clamp, so all in all I used 5 clamps total. Just wanted to get as much even pressure as possible along the entire length of all the wood. Once I got everything tightened down and in place, I used the mallet a couple more times. Like I just said, just beating that thing into submission, getting it to where it was as flat as possible. And once we got everything lined up how I liked it, just made sure the clamps were all evenly tight and let it sit for probably a good day before I took the clamps off. You can get to it sooner. I think Titebond, they say dries within 30 to 60 minutes, but I went ahead and just didn't have time to get back to it until the next day. So once the glue was dry the following day, I took all the clamps off. One of the scrap boards got a little glue on it, so I just hammered that off with a mallet real quick. And I know you're probably wondering, what in the world is this guy using to take the glue off with? Well, I don't have any chisels currently. I'm saving up for a nice set. I want to buy once, cry once with my chisel set. So I'm looking into the Narex Richters. I've heard some really good things about those chisels. But anyway, since I didn't have any when I was finishing this board, I put an edge on this big screwdriver that I had and just used that to gently scrape off all the squeeze out. before I got to sanding. Just wanted to take as much glue off as possible at first, just so the sanding process was a little faster. I also had this cheaper Irwin block plane. It didn't work very well, even though I did everything I could to, flatten the bottom, sharpen the blade, put the right bevel angle on it, all that stuff. So I ended up pulling out a card scraper. These things are awesome, by the way. I'll put a link in the description. And just use that to level the top of it, and also remove a lot of the glue. This worked really well, especially after I got most of it off with the sharpened screwdriver. After that, just used some 80 grit sandpaper and went to making sure I had a really nice flat surface. I probably should have used the pencil technique where you scribble some pencil all over the board. That way you know that you're sanding everything. You're not favoring any specific spots. I then flipped the board over and did the exact same thing to the other side, removing the glue, using the card scraper, and getting that initial sanding with the 80 grit. I tried using the cheap Irwin block plane again, but it ended up just chunking out the wood on the top, so I spent quite a bit of time adjusting the blade, resharpening it, flattening the bottom. I do have some experience in sharpening knives and other blades. Yeah, wasn't impressed with it. I ended up just doing more damage than good, so just went back to the card scraper to flatten that surface. And now that we got both sides smooth and flat, we're gonna take it over here to the miter saw. I just sheared off one of the edges so I had a nice slate to start from. And since I wanted these cuts to be very accurate, I went ahead for the first one, measured 2 inches since that's how thick I wanted my cutting board to be. I lined it up with the miter saw blade, and then I added a stop block using a clamp to the miter saw fence. This was just going to allow me to make sure that I had a very consistent length of cut for the entirety of the board. This was actually going to be a lot more accurate than me even using a tape measure after each cut. Alright, so once I got the stop block in place, it was time to make the first cut. I didn't want to pinch the blade here, which would also one, be a little dangerous, and then I also didn't want to burn the wood by creating too much friction. So just did this in some small passes here. I also made sure that with my left hand, I wasn't pushing into the blade. I was pushing back against the fence to hold it in place. In hindsight, I should have been moving the saw blade a little bit faster. I did end up burning it in several places, which proved to be pretty difficult to get out later with the sanding. So just hindsight's 2020, right? Next time if I was to do this, I would still obviously have to move it slow enough so the saw would do the work, but I would try to move it a little bit quicker so I didn't end up burning this end grain here. For the final cut, I didn't want my hand this close to the saw, so I used a C-clamp, just clamped it to the base there. This worked pretty well, didn't put any pressure on the blade, and allowed me to make a safe final cut. Now that I got all of my 2-inch sections cut and ready to go, took it back over to the table, flipped them all over on their end so all the end grain was facing up, and it was time to see how well I did. So as you can see here from looking down at it, there are some gaps in it. A lot of it was fixed when the pressure of the clamps squeezed everything together. It is important to make sure those first cuts you make are nice and straight because it'll come back to haunt you later. I also made a couple mistakes in the sanding process. Like I said, did not use the pencil technique as much as I should have, so I did favor a few spots. So I did have a couple low areas, and that contributed to a few of the gaps in here. Once I had everything ready to go, it was time to add more glue. And again, hindsight 2020, I should have added a lot more glue. This would have compensated for any of the gaps, but you'll see in a little bit how I tried to fix that. I did add some sawdust to it. I heard that this was a good technique to keep the boards from, when you're squeezing them together, them sliding around. And it did work pretty well. So added just a light dusting of sawdust, flipped them over, and it was time to tighten the clamps down and wait for the glue to dry. All right, so here is the result of that last glue up I did. There are some gaps I noticed in between the blocks on both sides. Not too bad, but I should have added more glue in hindsight. So what I'm gonna do now is just cut off all the squeeze out and then do a rough sanding. Then I'm gonna take the fine sawdust from when I was cutting the maple earlier and some wood glue, just fill in those gaps, let that dry. From what I hear, end grain is a lot harder to sand, so we'll see how my 80 grit and my little Black & Decker sander holds up. Let's take these clamps off and get started. Once the clamps were off, it was back to using my precision instrument to remove all of the squeeze out. After about 24 hours of doing this, well, okay, not 24 hours, but it sure felt like 24 hours. This did take a while. I'm sure there's a faster way to do it. I don't have a drum sander, and some people say you're not supposed to put this through a planer, but I also don't have a planer, so it didn't really matter. This was the quickest way I could figure out how to do it with a screwdriver, since I didn't have any chisels, and also using the card scraper. Then we got down to the 80 grit, and the rumors were true. End grain maple is extremely hard to sand. This end grain maple is taking quite a long time to finish up here. So we're just gonna keep putting some pencil marks on it lightly throughout the whole thing to make sure we're getting the whole area covered equally. I didn't get this end board lined up near close enough. Haven't even started on this side yet. So this one here, you can still see there's saw marks on it. We're just gonna keep hacking away at it and we'll get there eventually. Well, after about another hour and a half of sanding and fighting off the great temptation to run out and buy a belt sander real quick, we got it a little bit closer to the final product. Something else I did want to point out here is that you can see some of the coating from the pipe clamps actually, when the glue touched it, bled into the wood here along, and it's not coming out. It is in some spots, but it seemed to soak into the wood. So just wanted to mention that. Be careful with those pipe clamps. The pigment seems to bleed into the wood, and it ain't coming out of this end grain very well. So this is taking so long. I think I'm just gonna get it to something that I'm happy with. Get it back on the table saw, square these edges up. Let's see how good I can get it just with this 80 grit and working up to 120. Let's keep hacking away at it. Since this was just a cutting board that we were gonna use at our home on our countertop, I just wanted to get it roughly to the point where I was happy looking at it. So we got the rough sanding at the 80 grit, finished up, took it over to the table saw. I did use a straight board as a reference on one of the sides. I don't have a good crosscut sled for my table saw yet. So this just gave me a nice flat reference so that I could get a straight side. And then I just ran every other edge down the table saw, making sure all the sides were square and straight. After a thorough wipe down of the board, I then took some of the Titebond 3 and just any of the gaps that I saw, took a little bit of glue and put it in those gaps. I then took some fine sawdust, sprinkled it on top of this glue, and then just rubbed it in, trying to make sure all the seams were as flat and flush with each other as possible. And while I was waiting for the glue to dry and struggling for a while to get my bit swapped out on my trim router, I took a scrap piece of wood and a 3/8 inch roundover bit and a chamfer bit and just tested both of them to see which edge profile I liked and wanted to use on the cutting board. I ended up liking the 3/8 inch roundover bit the best, so that's the one I chose and went with to finish the entire board. And back to sanding. Imagine that. So just very briefly, this didn't take too long, obviously. Just went back to the 80 grit and sanded off the glue that I had just put on to fill in the gaps. And at this point, I took the 80 grit, went over all the edges. I did use pencil. I really wanted to make sure I kept those edges nice and straight that I had just made on the table saw. So I was very careful about being consistent and making sure I kept everything nice and straight. You also might have noticed that I've taken the dust catcher off the sander in a couple of the shots here throughout the video. And this was actually because the sawdust was sticking pretty heavily to the bottom of the sandpaper. And this was really slowing the sanding process down. So taking this bag off allowed the air to flow a lot freer through the sandpaper. It did make it a little more dusty in the shop, obviously. I did turn on my dust collection system right next to it, just clamping that hose right next to me on the table. And this actually did help a lot. But in case anybody was wondering, that's why the dust catcher was taken off of that little sander. So once I was done with the 80 grit, I went up to 120 grit sandpaper, then took the trim router and routed over all the edges, sprayed it down, gave it a water pop. This raises the little fibers of the wood. And then once it dries, I can come back over with a 120 grit sandpaper and smooth it all out. This is gonna give us a really smooth finish, or as smooth as I could get it. Like I said, it took a long time to sand this thing, so I got it as good as I could make it. And it's something I was happy with, and we're just gonna live with it. And we finally got it to the point where we can rub some finish on it. So I took a slightly damp cloth, wiped the whole thing down very thoroughly so that there was no sawdust left on it, and then took this 4-part white mineral oil to 1 part beeswax And I spread it very liberally all over the cutting board, leaving a lot of excess on it. Then I let it sit for 15 to 20 minutes to let it soak in. Then came back with a clean paper towel and just wiped off all the excess. And there you have it, my first attempt at a hard maple end grain cutting board. Final product right here, our end grain maple cutting board. Things I did wrong. I used pipe clamps and let the glue touch them, and the pigment went into the wood. It would not sand out. I spent probably three and a half hours sanding total, and it didn't come out. And I didn't even get it as flat as I wanted to. If I was to do this again, I probably would either go find a friend with a drum sander or have a drum sander myself. Probably won't be making an end grain cutting board for a while. Other thing I did wrong was I didn't get my cuts with the table saw at the very beginning perfectly straight, so my blocks were not perfectly square. I should have spent more time trying to get those lined up, maybe even have done a couple tests, because as you can see here, the squares are not perfectly square, so the seams don't line up, so it looks a little janky. The other thing I did wrong are burn marks. On several places here, you can see the burns on the wood. Maple is notorious for burning easily. That is what I was hearing, and it ended up being very true. So you gotta push it through the saw quick. You can't let it sit anywhere on the blade while it's spinning. It'll burn really easily. So maple end grain is very hard to sand. I found that out very quickly. You can still see some saw marks in here. It is smooth, but like I said, I spent a lot of time sanding, and I just had that little Black & Decker sander, so I wasn't gonna spend any more time. This is just gonna sit on my countertop, and it was a good little practice run. So anyways, things I did right was I had a card scraper. I love these things. They're super cheap. I can't imagine how much more time I would have been sanding if I didn't have these to scrape them off. Also, if you're gonna get a block plane, don't get a cheap block plane. Just save up and get a nice block plane. I broke my rule, the buy once, cry once rule. I went and bought this for a few bucks. It's basically useless. So I'll be throwing this away. This is an Irwin basic block plane. I'll have to go out and spend some better money on something like a Stanley or a Lee Nelson or something like that. But anyways, thankfully I did have some 3M Cubitron sandpaper, so even though I have a little tiny cheap sander, I definitely did notice a difference when I got that higher quality sandpaper. So that was a must, and I'm very glad I had that. One more mistake I made is I didn't use enough glue. Like I said, I didn't get these blocks perfectly square on the table saw at the beginning, so I should have put more glue to account for that, and I didn't, so I ended up having to go back and refill like you guys saw. If you like this video, subscribe, give it a thumbs up, really helps the channel out. Let me know in the comments what you guys would do differently to build an end grain cutting board. In the next video, I'm gonna be building some outdoor furniture and using some different finishing techniques on them to see how they turn out. So if that's something you guys wanna see, subscribe, follow along, and I'll see you guys in the next video.